Okay, then. Good morning, good evening, dear ladies and gentlemen. It's my really great pleasure and honor to welcome you at our second Simon Wiesenthal lecture this year, which is exactly the 75th lecture in the life of the Institute. My name is Eva Kovács, and I'm the head of academic affairs at the Vienna Wiesenthal Institute. And today, Miriam Wilhelm will be the co-chair of the lecture, and Sandro Fasching will kindly support the technical background. Thank you very much for you in advance. So welcome, Larry. I will also make a short introduction. Larry is the Julius Silver Professor of European History at New York University and the Executive Director of the NYU Remark Institute and the co-director of NYU Florence at Villa di La Pietra. Professor Wolff works on the history of Eastern Europe, the Habsburg monarchy, the Enlightenment, and on the history of childhood. He has been most interested in problems concerning East and West within Europe, whether concerning the Vatican and Poland, Venice and the Slavs, or Vienna and Galicia. In the book Inventing Eastern Europe, was published in 1994, he developed the argument that Eastern Europe was invented in the 18th century by the philosophers and travelers of the Enlightenment, who attributed meaning to support division of Europe into complementary regions, Western Europe and Eastern Europe. Professor Wolff has analyzed Western perspectives on Eastern Europe as a sort of demi-Orientalism, negotiating a balance between attributed difference and acknowledged resemblance. This book, The Inventing Eastern Europe, was the Bible of my generation in the 1990s because it helped us in the conceptual reorientation after the fall of the Iron Curtain. In his book about Dalmatia and Galicia, he has attempted to explore the meaning of Eastern Europe within imperial frameworks and the ideology of empire. His research on the history of childhood has included books on child abuse in Freud's Vienna, where I am now, or we are now, and child abuse in Casanova's Venice. His most recent book, The Singing Turks, is not the most recent, but one of the most recent books, The Singing Turk, concerns Turkish subject on the European operatic stage during the long 18th century and analyzes musical and dramatic representations in the concept of European-Ottoman relations. His current book was published in 2020 under the title Woodrow Wilson and the Reimaging of Eastern Europe. And in this tonight or today lecture, I assume we will get a taste of this book. Before I give the floor for our presenter, just a few technical information. For your comments and questions, please use the chat box on the bottom of the screen instead of Q&A. The chat feature allows you to communicate with us for the duration of the lecture. And as we agreed with Larry, the lecture will be recorded only for archival reasons and will not be published in any form. So it's a very, very intimate lecture today. And now, Larry, the floor is yours. Thank you very much for accepting our invitation.
Thank you so much, Eva. Thank you for that lovely introduction. And it's an honor for me to be presenting this Wiesenthal lecture in Vienna. I wish I could be in Vienna with you. Unfortunately, I'm in Manhattan and we are communicating through Zoom. I'm very pleased to see that there are friends and colleagues who I recognize in the audience, and I say hello to them and look forward to the conversation that will follow the lecture in the Q&A session. And I'm going to now share my screen so that you can follow the lecture along with me as I deliver it. It will be more fun to do this way, on Zoom especially. Here it is. You can see what a mess my desktop is. But now the mess is gone. So this is a lecture that I've actually created just for you. Eva, on majorities and minorities and plebiscites. It is a part of the book, but I've never actually put it together separately as a lecture before. And it was your suggestion that I focus on minorities that made me want to do this. And I've actually learned a lot myself about the material as I tried to organize this into a lecture to present to you all. Woodrow Wilson and the reimagining of Eastern Europe is a subject that I think most of the people in this public are probably a little bit familiar with. The ways in which Europe, as a Europe of empires in 1914, was transformed into a Europe of nation states in 1919, following the First World War, with Wilson as the presiding figure at the Paris Peace Conference, presiding over that transformation. And I will just say in passing, although this will not play a large part in the lecture, that it seems very remote from the work that Eva mentioned that I did many years ago on inventing Eastern Europe. But for me, it was a closely related subject. And what interested me about Wilson was the fact that, like the philosophers of the 18th century, Wilson never went to Eastern Europe, never laid eyes on Eastern Europe, was apparently not interested in going while he was in Europe for the peace conference. And to the best of my knowledge, barely thought about Eastern Europe until 1917. So everything he learned in 2 years. And for that reason, it's an interesting problem in mental mapping to try to understand where Wilson's ideas about Eastern Europe came from, how he came to feel that he was in a position to play such a very large role in the transformation of the map of the region. It all looks rather neat, divided into national states, as you see it here on the map of 1919. But what I'm going to be interested in and what I'm going to talk about today are the ways in which it was complicated by the issues of majorities and minorities, because you all know that if we were looking at an ethnographic map instead of a geopolitical map of borders, but this would be very messy looking when we thought about the correspondence of peoples to nation states. And Wilson himself only gradually came to appreciate how complicated that was. And that's a little bit what I want to trace with you today. Wilson's realization over the course of this very brief period from 1917 to 1919 that national self-determination is more complicated than he thinks it is. And in particular, the argument that I want to suggest to you is that minority rights, as it's really first laid out during the Paris Peace Conference, is the flip side of national self-determination. National self-determination being the fundamental Wilsonian principle, which rests on the idea of a majority. And it takes Wilson a little bit of time to turn over the coin and realize that on the other side of the majority lies the minority or the multiple minorities, and to try to understand how to come to terms with that. So I'm not actually going to begin with the famous 14 points speech of January 8th, 1918, which is when Wilson first laid out publicly some of his ideas about Eastern Europe. They're very famous, the 14 points, but points 10 through 13 deal with Austria-Hungary, the Balkans, the Ottoman Empire, and then finally point 13 deals with Poland and states the importance of an independent Polish state on territories of indisputably Polish populations, without Wilson realizing at the time how complicated it would be to determine what actually was meant by indisputably Polish populations. And the Poles themselves spend some time puzzling over what niewątpliwie should mean in terms of the mapping of a Polish state. This is an address that comes a month later that Wilson presents to the joint houses of Congress, in which, rather than 14 points, he lays out several basic principles that connect the 14 points. It's the first time that he very publicly emphasizes the importance of national self-determination. As you can see in the first quotation, national aspirations must be respected. Peoples may now be dominated and governed only by their own consent. Self-determination is not a mere phrase, it is an imperative principle, Wilson says. And then you can see in another takeout from the speech, he says that all well-defined national aspirations shall be accorded the utmost satisfaction that can be accorded them without introducing new and perpetuating old elements of discord and antagonism. And what I want to emphasize here is that it's really quite implicit in the speech that the satisfaction of national aspirations based on the principle of national self-determination might potentially introduce new elements of discord or perpetuate old elements of discord. And over the course of this talk, what I want to do is connect that to issues of majorities and minorities, as Wilson will only gradually come to realize over the course of the next year and a half following February 1918. So I want to begin now, I want to jump forward to October of 1918, the moment really when the war is about to end. This is 2 weeks before the end of the war. Wilson is presented with a memorandum that is written for him by his inquiry team. And I'll talk to you in a moment about the inquiry and what it represents. It's the team of experts that Wilson puts together to become informed about the wider world and perhaps about Eastern Europe especially, a region that, as I've said, he knows nothing about before this time. It's a memorandum that's put together for Wilson by the journalists Walter Lippmann and Frank Cobb. Walter Lippmann, someone who's going to become one of the most important journalist figures in American public life over the course of the next half century. And they lay out for Wilson some of the complications of what he has to look for in a peace settlement. About Czechoslovakia, which has just declared its independence in October of 1918. The memorandum notes that its territories include at least 1 million Germans for whom some provision must be made. Of course, we actually know the number should be 3 million Germans, but I would want to point out that this is something that Wilson has not thought about for a moment yet. The fact that there is going to be a German population in the new Czechoslovakia. Lippmann Cobb point out that Poland should receive no territories in which Lithuanians or Ukrainians predominate. So here the memorandum is making explicit for Wilson the complication of what it means to think about a new Poland that will involve only indisputably Polish territories. And finally, with regard to Poland's western regions, if Poznan and Silesia go to Poland, rigid protection must be afforded the minorities of Germans and Jews living there, as well as in other parts of the Polish state. And at this moment, minorities becomes an issue on Wilson's desk that he has to really think about for the first time with the war about to end, what it means to think about protecting minorities within new national states, since he himself is one of the principal advocates of the creation of these new national states. That's the young Walter Lippmann, by the way, you're looking at up there on the left. Over here, what you're looking at is the basis of the inquiry team that was put together for Wilson by his close confidant, Colonel House, whom you see in the center here, standing behind the sofa. It was chaired by the president of the City University of New York, Sidney Messis, and included a team of experts, mostly academics, and they're very interesting to me for the reason that they really create the field of, say, East European history as we know it in the United States. I'll say a little bit more about that as we move along. But this team of guys, and I think we can use the gendered term guys here because, man, they are all guys. They are the ones who are providing Wilson with the information that he thinks he needs in order to make informed decisions about the peace settlement and about Eastern Europe in particular. Isaiah Bowman right here on the couch is his mapping expert, the person who is providing him with maps. So Wilson is supposed to have remarked, it's possible that this is an apocryphal story, while he's on the boat going to Europe in December of 1918, on the way to the peace conference. 3 million Germans in Bohemia? That's curious. Masaryk never told me that. It's a remark that's cited in several places, and if it's not actually, literally, concretely true, the spirit of it is certainly true. Wilson formed a personal relationship with Masaryk during the war. They met when Masaryk was in the United States. Their friendship is something that was and still is celebrated in Czech history. Here you see them linked together on a postcard as the liberators of the Czechoslovak nation. And Masaryk did not inform Wilson of the fact that, and you can see over here, I've given you a little bit of an ethnographic map, that there would be massive German populations in the new Czechoslovakia that Masaryk wanted to create. And this element of surprise on Wilson's part, it gives you a sense of what he needed to think through as he arrived in Paris, the ways in which national self-determination, that is to say, in this case, the national self-determination of a Czechoslovak nation, something that we no longer think is a real thing, a Czechoslovak nation, but the ways in which majority national states would create minority populations, indeed very large minority populations. Or here's Wilson later looking back to wartime when he became friends with the Polish leader, pianist, statesman, Ignacy Jan Paderewski. They met in Washington with the more complicated figure of Roman Dmowski, the founder of Polish national democracy. And Wilson, looking back on this meeting from 1919, says, I'm sorry, I miswrote this. It's, we must not allow ourselves to be influenced too much by the Polish state of mind. I saw Mr. Dmowski and Mr. Paderewski in Washington, and I asked them to define for me Poland as they understood it, and they presented me with a map in which they claimed a large part of the earth. So this is Wilson able to be a little bit humorous, something we don't always see in Wilson. A humorous Wilson is a little bit elusive, about Polish claims, looking back on it from the perspective of the peace conference, but on claims that he took a lot more seriously when they were presented to him in the White House during the war, and when they eventually became part of his peace program, that is to say, point 13 of the 13 points. Again, in Poland, the issue of minorities was going to be very important. And with the war about to end in November of 1918, right, this is Louis Marshall, the president of the American Jewish Committee, writing to Wilson on November 7th, 4 days before the end of the war. He writes about concern for Jews in an independent Poland. Marshall fears, quote, unspeakable evil unless the constitution of the new Poland shall contain guarantees adequate for the protection of the Jewish inhabitants. And Marshall outlines some of the possibilities: the importance of citizenship for all inhabitants, equal rights for all citizens, no discrimination on account of race or religion, no restriction on the use of Yiddish or Hebrew language, autonomous management of Jewish religion and education, and the right to work on Sunday. There are a whole agenda of issues connected to minority rights that, again, Wilson has not thought about for one moment before November 7th, 1918, which are suddenly on his desk and are going to be part of the portfolio of issues that he takes with him to Paris the following month. 4 days later, Poland becomes independent on November 11th. November 11th is still Polish Independence Day, and the situation that Marshall envisioned has now become real. Poland is independent, and the issues of minority rights and protection are on the table. 5 days later, Marshall writes to Wilson again. Would it not be a practicable thing to let these gentlemen understand that their aspirations for a new Poland cannot receive sympathetic consideration until they first give evidence that they are possessed with the spirit of justice and righteousness, which is essential to the establishment of a free and independent government. Only then can the world regard the establishment of the new state without misgivings. For it is inconsistent with the grant of the political independence that one part of the inhabitants of a state shall be the victims of the hate, prejudice, and intolerance of a majority. So I just want to focus in, there's a lot to unpack here, but I would just want to focus in on the word majority and the ways in which Marshall wants Wilson to understand this as a problem of majority rule, the minorities that it automatically creates, and the issues that then need to be addressed. Here we are on November 16th. By November 21st to 23rd, there is a huge pogrom that takes place in Lviv, Lemberg, within newly independent Poland. There's been a Polish-Ukrainian war for Lviv taking place over the course of November, which leads to a Polish victory and then a pogrom against the Jews of Lviv between November 21st and 23rd. Lviv is a city which barely has a Polish majority. It could hardly be considered indisputably Polish in its population by the Habsburg census of 1910, which gives us figures that are something like this. We're looking at the Jewish quarter down below after the pogrom. And one of the things that I would want to emphasize here is that it's precisely the lifting of Habsburg sovereignty, which makes the issues of majority and minority into issues that are fought out in the streets through civil wars and expressed in pogroms. If we were thinking about the Habsburg monarchy, and it seems appropriate to think about it for in a lecture that I am giving virtually in Vienna, I would want to point out to you that Habsburg constitutional law, the Grundgesetz of 1867, does in fact provide probably the most significant precedent for thinking about how to manage relations between national majority and minority populations, with an understanding that the question of who's in a majority and who's in a minority depends on how you define the precise territory that you are discussing. Article 19 of the Grundgesetz says that all races, Volksstämme, of the state shall have equal rights. Each race shall have the inviolable right of maintaining and cultivating its nationality and language. I want to point out to you that that's very close to what Lewis Marshall is putting on the table for Wilson when he thinks about Jewish rights in an independent Poland. Within the Habsburg monarchy, this was something that was elaborately negotiated through the constitutional courts, what it meant for the state to recognize, as Article 19 specifies, the equality of various languages in the schools, public offices, and in public life. In the countries populated by several races, the institutions of public instruction shall be so organized that each race may receive the necessary instruction in its own language without being obliged to learn a second language. So this was a very complicated system for thinking about how to negotiate national rights among populations of diverse languages and cultures. As soon as it's suspended with the end of the Habsburg monarchy, all of those relations among peoples need to be renegotiated within the framework of the new national states. And while the Habsburg monarchy was not always successful in negotiating relations among peoples, it was probably the most advanced technology, legal technology for doing such things that existed in the world up until that moment. And with the suspension, with the end of Habsburg law, it fell to the national states themselves to try to think through these problems or try to avoid thinking through these problems. And as in the case of Lviv, we see national tensions erupting into the streets in the fall of 1918. The Peace Conference creates something quite new, a committee on new states and for the protection of minorities. I think you could write a whole history of this committee that would be really, really interesting. And what I want to emphasize about it to start with is that they go together new states and the protection of minorities. And we could say new national majority states and the protection of minorities. And I want to point out again the ways in which majority national self-determination is the flip side of minority rights and the protection of minorities. One necessarily implies the other, and it's the priority of creating new national states that forces upon the peace conference the problem of thinking through guarantees, protections, and rights for minorities. The crucial players on this committee: Hedla Maury from British Political Intelligence. He's a history and a classicist. And David Hunter Miller, a lawyer who's very interested in international law and plays a role on the inquiry team that I told you, that I mentioned to you before. There you can see Miller leaning onto the couch from the side. He's one of the principal legal figures who is informing the inquiry and therefore informing Wilson. He plays a crucial role on that committee, which will be making the most important recommendations to Wilson and to the conference as a whole about minority rights. The most interesting player on the inquiry team, from my point of view, is this guy, Archibald Carey Coolidge, who was a professor at Harvard for many years, the director of the Harvard University Library System as well, and the person who introduced Eastern Europe into the curriculum at Harvard, and therefore really introduced Eastern Europe into the curriculum in the United States as a whole. He's the most important person who is providing Wilson with information about Eastern Europe. In professor style, he has his graduate students working with him on the team, providing specialized information that he lacks himself. These are the people who have done what Wilson has never done. They've actually been to the region. They've traveled to Eastern Europe. They've actually studied the region. Coolidge is someone who does not spend the peace conference in Paris. He spends the peace conference in Vienna, where you are, supplying Wilson with information from Vienna as he travels around what are now the former territories of the Habsburg monarchy at the beginning of 1919, and writes reports for Wilson from Vienna. I do want to point out that Archibald Carey Coolidge, when I say he created the whole field, I mean his PhD student, who was at the Paris Peace Conference, was Robert Kerner, who became professor of East European history at Berkeley. Kerner's PhD student at Berkeley was Wayne Vucinic, who became the professor of East European history at Stanford. Wayne Vucinic at Stanford was my PhD professor. So in 4 generations, you move from Coolidge to me. The whole field descends from Coolidge as it exists in the United States. Coolidge prepares a memorandum for Wilson on the new frontiers in former Austria-Hungary. It's a kind of wonderful oxymoron, right? The idea of creating frontiers within a former geopolitical entity. He points out that many Germans will have to be citizens of the new Bohemia in any event, but the number should be cut down wherever this can be done without subtracting a considerable number of Czechs from the population. So what I want to point out to you here is that what Coolidge is interested in doing is, again, something quite new. He's interested in a technology of minimizing minorities. He understands that there actually are going to be minorities within the new geopolitical frontiers, but he's introducing Wilson to the idea that the adjustment of those frontiers can minimize or maximize the extent of minority populations, that it's a mathematical field of addition and subtraction in which you can think about possible borders and do the math in terms of how many people it will leave on either side of the border. And it's something that's going to weigh on Wilson over the course of the peace conference, the question of where you draw the borders and who lies on what side of those borders, and to what extent you minimize minority populations or maximize or increase the concerns over minority populations. Coolidge prepares in Vienna a memorandum on the rights of national minorities, in which he tells Wilson it is urgent that some understanding should be reached and proclaimed by the conference as to what constitutes at least the minimum of these rights: political, linguistic, religious. There are today many millions of people who are about to be handed over to or left under the rule of others with whom they are at present in deep enmity, and from whom they can see no reason to expect generous treatment in the future. So I want to emphasize that Coolidge is doing this from Vienna, from the center of the now former Habsburg monarchy, and with an awareness of the history of the monarchy and the ways in which the abolition of the monarchy is creating new and complicated political situations, which are not simply utopian national solutions in the way that Masaryk led Wilson to expect they would be in the White House during World War I. Coolidge writes that it's important to tranquilize apprehensions, and that's going to be a crucial theme of the peace conference discussions around minorities. And because we're looking at societies with a lot of apprehension about what the new system of national states are going to mean for minority populations. And Coolidge advocates a statement from the conference of the broad principles of human rights, which should and must prevail in assuring the new national minorities the life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness to which they are entitled and which now seem so gravely menaced. It's an American formula, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, which is meant to be applied not to the new national states that are becoming independent with their national majorities, but to the apprehensive new national minorities that are being created at the same time. On May 1st, in the Council of Four, you see them there up above. It's Vittorio Orlando, Lloyd George, Clemenceau, and Wilson. President Wilson said it had been brought to his attention that the Jews were somewhat inhospitably regarded in Poland. And he proposed a statement of commitment for possible incorporation into the treaties that were about to emerge. Wilson loved this idea of the state of blank, in which you could fill in the blank. You could use it for any country. He specifically mentioned Poland, Romania, and Czechoslovakia, each state required to accord to all racial or national minorities within its jurisdiction exactly the same treatment and security alike in law, and in fact, that is, accorded the racial or national majority. So I want to emphasize a couple of things here. First of all, the issue of Jews in Poland is really fundamental for forcing Wilson to think this through. And as I'll show to you, Louis Marshall is not the only representative of the American Jewish community who brings this issue to Wilson's attention. But the case of the Jews in Poland is actually going to serve as an exemplar for thinking in a much larger way about minority populations within the new Eastern Europe. And for Wilson, at least, it's the state of blank, fill in the blank, required to protect the blank minorities, fill in the blank, depending on the state. Wilson is interested in this as an abstract principle of general applicability. I do also want to point out to you the racial or national minorities issue and the sloppiness in the way those terms are used at the beginning of the 20th century. And it's interesting to think about at a moment in which Wilson's racism in an American domestic context has been a large issue. may or may not be aware that Wilson's name was recently, last year, during the pandemic year, removed from the school at Princeton that bore his name for a very long time because of Wilson's domestic racism in the context of American politics. And Wilson's issues surrounding race, and I won't really have time to talk about this today, though I'm happy to talk about it later if you'd like during the Q&A, intersects with some of his ideas about nation and ethnicity and even religion, which it connects to through Jews. There's a sloppiness of terms here in which the ways that in which peoples are categorized all overlap in this period of discussion during the peace conference. There's the Council of Four that is making the decisions. I introduced Wilson on the far right. I introduced you to them already. And I want to give a little bit of the flavor of their conversation, these four guys, as they come upon the issue of minorities. Wilson, a detailed text was prepared on the status of the citizens of Poland. This plan was drafted after consultation with the representatives of the minorities. What I do not like is that they demand a sort of autonomy for the national minorities. Lloyd George, this is a claim of the Jews who wish to form a state within the state, a sort of state within the state. Nothing would be more dangerous. Wilson, the reason why I ask that the general stipulations, which I just indicated, be included in the treaty with Germany is that Poland is incorporating several million German subjects into her territory. Again, new discovery for Wilson. It's part of it comes up in the Lippmann-Cobb memorandum. Lloyd George, in any case, these stipulations must be imposed upon the Poles. There is obviously something to say to justify the hostile feeling of the Poles against the Jews. Little odd, but Lloyd George does go in that direction. Mr. Paderewski told me that during the war, the Jews of Poland were by turns for the Germans, for the Russians, for the Austrians, and very little for Poland herself. Wilson, it is the result of long persecution. The Jews of the United States are good citizens. It is the same in England. Clemenceau chimes in, and in France. Clemenceau, by the way, of the three of them, is the only one who has actually been to Polish territory. I did not realize this until I began working on this project, but Clemenceau in the late 1890s makes a short voyage en Galicie, right, and writes about it. He travels to Galicia and writes about Poles, Ukrainians, and Jews in Galicia, a short book. And of the people around the table in Paris who are pronouncing upon these subjects, Clemenceau is the only one who has any direct experience. So these are issues that are being batted back and forth among the big three, and I would say not at a very high level of sophistication. You can tell me what you think later about the ways in which they are discussing these issues. I would say not because they're not smart men, but because these are new issues for them that they are turning over as they discover them and improvising on in conversation with one another. This is really quite new material. Yes, rights for minorities, but not actually autonomy for minorities. Can Jews be good citizens? Yes, no, yes, right? It's something that they are batting back and forth. Meanwhile, as I've suggested to you, there are American Jewish representatives who are trying to get Wilson's attention around Jewish issues in particular. Rabbi Stephen Wise, born in Budapest in 1874, writes a memorandum for Wilson in March 1919. He's the leader of one of the creators of the American Jewish Congress and a leader of the Reform community in the United States. He writes about the effect upon the Jews of the organization of new and enlarged states in Eastern Europe, the guarantees required by the Jews to secure for them fundamental human rights. Accounts must be taken of the newly formulated and intense desire of all of the various ethnic minorities in Eastern Europe to preserve their cultural identity. And I want you to notice that even Rabbi Wise, who is without any doubt principally concerned about Jewish minorities in Eastern Europe, understands that this is an issue that has to be generalized to all of the various ethnic minorities in Eastern Europe. And the thing that interests me most about the way that Wise formulates this, and one could say more about this, is that for him, it's really not just a question about Jews in Poland. He understands, he's born in Budapest himself, that there are other countries besides Poland that are in play here that will have Jewish minorities. But maybe even more broadly, he understands Eastern Europe as a conceptual identity for a region that will have minorities who are not just national minorities, but regional minorities across the region. And these might be Jews and Germans in particular. Wise writes that the peoples of Eastern Europe are all of them suppliants for political rights. Poland, Romania, Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia are suing for sovereignty and for enlarged boundaries. In Wilson's terms, the state of blank. Nobody will begrudge them the realization of their dreams. The Jews of Eastern Europe also come to present their cause for adjudication. They are not seeking sovereignty or specific privileges, but merely justice. They behold in the peace conference their last opportunity to secure those rights which are conceded to all other men. Last opportunity in part because the territory itself is being filled, right? New nation states are filling up the map. They are about to be established. And one of the things that Wise is noting for Wilson's benefit, which is going to become very important, is that this is the moment when these states are being established. If minorities are going to possess rights in new majority states, they have to possess those rights from the moment of the establishment of the new majority states. Marshall writes to Wilson again that spring to say that the hopes of all minority groups of Eastern Europe rest upon that wholehearted sympathy that you have unfailingly evinced for the oppressed. It is therefore that I venture to call your attention to the atrocities to which the Jews of Poland and Galicia have recently been subjected. He may be referring to the Lviv pogrom of the previous fall, even at the very moment whilst the peace conference is engaged in bestowing sovereign powers and extensive territories upon Poland. Those familiar with these lands and with the forces now in operation are agreed that unless the great powers, as a condition of the official recognition of any new government, therein, whatever it be, shall effectively protect the Jewish and other minorities, there will unquestionably result horrors unprecedented in the annals of human atrocities. So very strong speech, hyperbolic speech, I think we would say, from Marshall to Wilson. And I'm interested in the fact that Marshall appeals to Wilson here in his messianic role, the idea that all minority groups of Eastern Europe rest upon that wholehearted sympathy that you have unfailingly evinced for the oppressed. Up until this moment, Wilson has been the messiah for the majority groups. It's been the Poles, the Czechs, the Yugoslavs who have looked to Wilson in the messianic role as the creator of their new national majority states, redeeming them from past oppression. Wilson would even say emancipating them from enslavement in his own somewhat inflated messianic rhetoric of concerning his own role. Here, Marshall is asking Wilson to be a messiah for the minority groups as well. Probably the correct avenue for appealing to Wilson's sense of himself. Felix Frankfurter from Harvard Law School, born in Vienna, present in Paris in 1919, forwards to Wilson a report from Warsaw decrying anti-Semitic persecutions that are allegedly taking place, such that the Polish government must be bullied and browbeaten into quitting its policy of extermination and persecution. And Marshall makes the rather extraordinary suggestion that every new government should be required to give the pledge that no pogroms shall take place and take absolute responsibility for pogroms that might take place within their national borders. Pogroms being often understood to be a form of popular violence, the idea that new states should take responsibility for them is one piece of evidence for the way that people are wrestling with a way to come to terms with what the role of new national majority states should be with regard to minorities. On May 17th, the Council of Four reviews the report of the Committee on New States and for the Protection of Minorities, the committee that I signaled for you before. They recommend guarantees of citizenship for minorities, religious freedom, free use of minority language, and education in the minority language in particular districts with future, and this the most controversial piece, future right of appeal to the League of Nations in the case of the violation of minority rights. This is something that the new states will resent tremendously, the idea that the League of Nations has any opportunity or role of intervention in their internal domestic politics. Controversial points have to do with the forbidding of elections on Saturday, which some feel would be a virtual disenfranchisement of the Jews, and the question of whether Jews are to be allowed to work on Sunday, which would be regarded as an unusual advantage against the Christians in countries with Sunday work laws. David Hunter Miller, the lawyer who is one of the crucial figures on the committee, I signaled him again before, says that the committee's recommendations do not go as far as the American Jews desire, but in my judgment go further than any such treaty has ever gone before. So just let me say one word about precedents here. There are precedents for intervention in treaty intervention on behalf of minority populations, going back as far as the late 18th century to the role that Catherine the Great, say, presumes to play on behalf of the Orthodox populations within the Ottoman Empire at the time of the Russian-Turkish Wars. It's part of what enters into the Treaty of Küçük-Kaynarca in 1774 at the end of the Russian-Turkish War. And it's something that we see in play through the 19th century, a concern to protect Christian populations, especially within the Ottoman Empire, and then is written into treaty at the time of the Congress of Berlin, in which the new national states in southeastern Europe are obliged to provide guarantees of equality of rights for different religions in Bulgaria, in Romania, in Serbia, in Montenegro. And what we're looking at that's brand new here is the extension of this principle to not beyond religious groups. And as you can see, it starts with a concern about minority rights for Jews to national groups. And Jews are partly conceived as a national group in this context, although some of the issues surrounding the Saturday Sabbath are clearly religious issues. Lloyd George in the Council of Four felt that Hebrew should be taught as an ancient language, but not Yiddish, as every effort ought to be made to merge the Jews of Poland in Polish nationality, just as the Jews in Great Britain or France became merged in British or French nationality, right? These are guys who are trying to reason from their own limited experience. Wilson, when asked what was done in New York, guessed that teachers were appointed who understood Yiddish, and they gave their instruction in Yiddish, something which I do not think actually occurred. American literary critic Irving Howe, on his first day of school in New York in the 1920s, was laughed at for speaking Yiddish. That afternoon, I told my parents I had made my mind up never to speak Yiddish to them again. Interestingly, right now in New York, a proposal is on the table for a bilingual Yiddish-English public school for children from Orthodox Jewish communities. But I think it's something quite new. What I want to emphasize here is that Lloyd George, like Wilson, is reasoning about materials that he knows very little about. If you wanted advice about education in national languages, you would need to turn to officials of the former Habsburg monarchy, who had a lot of experience in thinking through issues of language instruction in public schools and how to balance the relation between majorities and minorities. I want to switch subjects for a moment here and point out to you some of the concerns that Wilson felt around minority populations. Looking at the Adriatic and the balance between the Italians and Slavs, he writes that if the Slavs have the feeling of an injustice, that will make the chasm unbridgeable and will open the road to Russian influence and the formation of the Slavic bloc hostile to Western Europe. There's a concern about minority resentment. And President Wilson said in May, he not only had a friendly feeling towards the Jews, but he thought it was perfectly clear that one of the most dangerous elements of ferment arose from the treatment of the Jews. The fact that the Bolshevist movement had been led by the Jews was partly due to the fact that they had been treated largely as outlaws. So Bolshevism is partly on his mind. Russian influence is partly on his mind when he thinks about issues of minority resentment as it might emerge if the rights of minorities were not guaranteed. The new states are greatly resentful of the idea of minority treaties being imposed upon them. Wilson writes, Mr. Brătianu, the prime minister of Romania, you see him on the left, Ion Brătianu, and I speak of his suggestions with the utmost respect, suggested we could not, so to speak, invade the sovereignty of Romania and ancient sovereignty and make certain prescriptions with regard to the rights of minorities. But I beg him to observe that he's overlooking the fact that he is asking the sanction of the Allied and associated powers for great additions of territories which come to Romania by the common victory of arms. And therefore, we are entitled to say, if we agree to these additions of territory, we have the right to insist upon certain guarantees of peace. And Paderewski objects that the treaty, any treaty, should admit the intervention of the chief powers in Poland's internal affairs. So prime ministers of new states regard this as outrageous and unacceptable. Wilson, May 3rd, notes that anti-Semitism in Poland is very sharp. I remind you on the subject of the personal attitude of Mr. Dmowski. Dmowski, who was in fact one of the leading figures of ideological anti-Semitism in Poland, the creator of the national democracy movement. David Hunter Miller, the attorney on the committee for the new state, says, you will make Poland sign what you want, provided you ask her for it before the signing of the treaty, which gives her her frontiers and her international status. And Lloyd George says, I repeat that we have a grip on the Poles as long as the treaty with Germany is not signed. This is not something that any Polish representatives would have wanted to hear. It's, in fact, just the kind of conversation at the peace conference that they would have been most anxious about, but a keen sense that at the moment that Poland is created is the one moment when the conference can impose its concerns about national minorities. And Henry Morgenthau, another leader from the American Jewish community, writes on June 20th, the week before the signing of the treaty, if a Polish treaty with minority guarantees were not signed simultaneously with the German treaty, then it may never be signed in its present shape, and minorities will again be exposed to the tyranny and injustice of majorities. Morgenthau, you see him here on an Armenian stamp because Morgenthau was the American ambassador to Constantinople during World War I, was one of the people who testified to what was the genocidal treatment of the Armenians in Anatolia during World War I. And his sense of what minorities might be exposed to was very, very powerful when he wrote to Wilson about this in June of 1919. Morgenthau would actually be sent to Poland in the summer of 1919 to investigate issues of pogroms and anti-Semitism. And there we see Morgenthau in Poland. And he would come away with a Morgenthau report, which actually suggested that reports of anti-Semitic incidents had been overstated in the media, and that that they should be regarded somewhat critically. I want to say a word about plebiscites, and I want to try to finish in the next 5 to 10 minutes as well, because I'm taking too long, but I'm enjoying speaking to you. But I do want to try to finish in the next 5 or 10 minutes. A word about plebiscites, because they're really crucial for Wilson in his thought about how you deal with those borders that subtract or add to minority populations. The plebiscite looks at a very particular territory, and you vote your nationality basically. It determines what is the majority and minority within some small territory and uses that majority vote in order to determine what the political adherence of that territory ought to be. In other words, whoever turns out to be the minority in that territory will then become the minority in the new state to which the territory is attached. Wilson's thinking about the Dalmatian Islands in May. He writes, in the case of the islands, the only way to settle the question of which population predominated was a plebiscite, since official statistics were disputed both by the Italians and the Yugoslavs. I want to remind you that plebiscites are super important in America and super important to the American progressive movement that Wilson belonged to in the early 20th century. Very democratic referendums. I don't know if you know this, Americans vote on referendums all the time, not at a national level, but at a state level, for instance, in Oregon or in New Jersey. And they were regarded by the progressive movement as far more democratic than legislative decisions because people vote directly on issues. It's only quite recently that we've had reason to think about the ways in which referendums give encouragement to non-democratic forces. And I would say that the Brexit referendum in 2016 was a little bit of a wake-up call for all of us in what's involved in simplifying important decisions into yes-no referendums. Anyway, Wilson believes in referendums in the United States. Right here we see initiatives and referendums taking over from legislative government. And here we see Wilson endorsing the referendum on women's suffrage, which was introduced in New Jersey in 1915, while Wilson was president of the United States, but could vote as a New Jerseyan, I suppose, since he came out of Princeton and had been the president of Princeton. And I should say that the referendum on women's suffrage in New Jersey in 1915 was defeated. So Wilson is thinking about referendums all the time in the late spring of 1919. He's got a Colonel Sherman Miles who's conducting an investigation in Carinthia to determine the border between Austria and Yugoslavia. And Miles reports, we had a unique opportunity to apply the principle of self-determination in the field. For 10 days, we covered the district, visiting towns and hamlets unexpectedly and talking to people of all classes. We had with us one representative of each of the two sides and were ourselves able to question the people, both in the German and Slovene languages. We found that the majority of the people, though Slovene by blood, called themselves Wendish and desired to remain under Austrian rule. They're going house to house, surveying people as to their nationality. This is in some sense the ideal Wilsonian method, which finds its more abstract technology in the referendum. Miles, there we see him as a young cadet, says, I understand that the present intention is to permit the people of the disputed area to express their will by plebiscite 5 years hence. I believe this should be done. But the question now is under which government, Yugoslav or Austrian, should the disputed area rest during the next 5 years, raising a complicated question for Wilson of whether plebiscites, which are a national form of referendums, can really be clean and pure as voting experiments, or whether the government that is in present for the next 5 years will actually shape the outcome of the referendum. I've thought about the question of Silesia, says Wilson on June 3rd. It appears to me difficult to hold a plebiscite in that region. It would be necessary to begin by making the German officials leave. My advisors say it will not be possible to obtain a truly free and genuine vote from a population which has been so long in a state of vassalage concerning the disputed population, Polish and German, of Upper Silesia. Just in the last 2 weeks of May, Wilson undergoes a transformation in which he goes from a big believer in referendums and plebiscites into someone who's a little nervous about how plebiscites work and whether they can be meaningful as an instrument of national self-determination. Here's one of his advisors from the inquiry team. I won't spend time on this. This is R.H. Lord, who goes on to become an important Polish historian and a Catholic priest. He's one of Archibald Carey Coolidge's graduate students at Harvard, who is advising Wilson that plebiscites can be difficult. To make a plebiscite genuinely fair, it would be necessary to remove all the German authorities and free the Polish population from all the shackles upon it. Lloyd George becomes very frustrated with this. Silesia has been detached from Poland for 700 years. All that I ask is that the population have the right to speak for itself. Exactly. Can it do it? Says Wilson. It is possible we would have to occupy the territory during the plebiscite. In this case, the Germans will say that the vote took place under the pressure of our bayonets. That matters little if we ourselves have good reason to think the vote took place freely. I know what intimidation by great landowners is like. I had some examples of it in Wales. Lloyd George believes he can speak for small East European peoples because he comes from Wales. But I want you to notice the struggle over the technology of the plebiscite that's taking place here. And it goes back and forth between the two of them, in which Lloyd George ends up accusing Wilson of stepping back from self-determination. And Wilson has to respond, I cannot allow you to say that I am not for the right of peoples to self-determination. That is absurd. But what Wilson has discovered is that the majority principle of self-determination has certain minority complications. Discusses with Paderewski, who also believes that a plebiscite is absolutely impossible, that people will follow the German clergy in Silesia. The plebiscites ultimately take place in Carinthia, Schleswig, and East Prussia in 1920. In Silesia in 1921, there's the poster for it, vote for Poland and you will be free, but you have to have it in both languages. Vote Stimme für Polen und du wirst frei sein. So, it's a disaster, the Silesian plebiscite. It's fought out by paramilitary groups, and the outcome on the ground is determined by the paramilitary struggles. Do want to point out to you that Eastern Galicia, with its mixed Polish and Ukrainian population, was supposed to have a plebiscite in 25 years. That was how long they thought it would take for Eastern Galicia to be clean enough to have a free plebiscite. It would have taken place in 1943, at which point Eastern Galicia was occupied by the Nazis. So there was certainly no question of a plebiscite. But I wanted to give it as an example of a plebiscite projected into the remote future from 1918, 1919. Ongoing discussion in which Lloyd George includes Wilson of trying to load the dice in producing the outcome of the Silesian plebiscite that he wants. And I'm going to pass from that to my final point that I want to make, which is about the very small territories of Spiš and Orava, which lie in between Poland and, here it's listed as Czechia, though it's really Slovakia, right? It's really between the Polish and the Slovak lands in the Tatra Mountains. We're looking at a poster from the period 1918 or 1919 that says Spiš and Orava want to belong to the common fatherland. And since it's written in Polish, that means that the common fatherland for them, the Ojczyzna, is Poland. Here's where Orava is. Tiny little territory in the Tatra Mountains. Here's Wilson's press secretary, March 31st. I came into my office and found it smelling like a sheep pen. Two peasants from northern Czechoslovakia in their homespun natural wool peasants' clothing. A Polish chaplain was there to interpret. Here's the account. A quaint petition in boots reached Paris today in the form of a party of Polish peasants from the Orava and Spiš districts of northern Hungary, that is Slovakia. They object to the proposed plan of annexing them to Czechoslovakia and are seeking audience with President Wilson. The delegation, wearing suits of thick white wool, felt, gaily decorated with red embroidery and high Cossack caps of black shaggy fur, attracted much attention when they arrived at the Hotel Crillon and sought an audience with the president. Here's minority politics acted out in the most dramatic and most personal way with mountaineers, goat herds, in fact. They're smelling like a sheep pen, but they're actually goat herds from the mountains who come to Paris to tell Wilson that they don't want to be a minority in Czechoslovakia. They want to belong to Poland with their national population, to the extent that mountaineers actually had a sense of national identity at the beginning of the 20th century. They believed themselves to be Polish. The press secretary, the American press secretary, obviously wildly condescending in his report on their presence, on their smell, on their dress, and the attention that they attract. This is not they, but another picture of mountaineers from the region, and there's the Hotel Crillon behind them. We can imagine what sort of an impression they would have made. They make a good and very powerful impression on Wilson. I must tell you how moved I was yesterday by a visit of a group of Polish peasants who came from their country, having traveled 60 kilometers on foot to the nearest station. They begged me to see to it that the line of the frontier unites them to Poland, their country, not to make them subjects of the Czechoslovak Republic. Their simplicity and passion were touching. This is a case of one of those indentations in the drawing of the frontiers about which it is so difficult for us to decide. And here's another report that on the two Galician peasants, by which the Wilson's doctor meant Galician, which will again remark upon their smell and on their costume and the ways in which Wilson was impressed. 28th of January, Wilson is present for the signing of the Versailles Treaty in the Hall of Mirrors at Versailles. This is my conclusion. I'm at the end now, and I'm sorry for have gone on longer than I meant to. On June 28, 1919, Treaty of Versailles is signed with Germany. Want to remind you that Morgenthau told Wilson a week before, if a Polish treaty is not signed simultaneously with the German treaty, it will never be signed in its present shape, the Minority Treaty. Polish Minority Treaty is signed on June 28, 1919, the exact same day, requiring total and complete protection of life and freedom of all people, regardless of their birth, nationality, language, race, or religion, with the obligations guaranteed by the League of Nations. This will become the template for another dozen minority treaties that will be signed with new states in Eastern Europe over the coming years. Poles renounce it in 1934 as soon as they safely feel that they can. Poland hails the end of the treaty on minorities, right? And they parade past Pilsudski's residence at the Belvedere in Warsaw. Three powers rebuke Poland on treaty, but that's not seen coming yet on June 28th. June 28th, 1919 is the end of the war. Treaty signed, war over. Wilson leaves Paris, sails Sunday. Germans pledge to act in good faith. We know that the treaty's not going to have a happy ending. We know it's the ways in which it's going to unravel in the 1930s. Wilson might have had a lot of things to be anxious about on June 28, 1919. The one thing we know he was anxious about was this. He writes to his Secretary of State, those simple peasants whose pictures are enclosed, who walked 40 or 50 miles to a railway station in their mountain country and came all the way to Paris to beg that their little mountain pocket might be attached to Poland. As I'm clearing up my papers, I'm deeply chagrined to find that I forgot to pay attention to their claims. If it is not too late, as I sincerely hope it is not, will you not be kind enough to have someone look into the matter and rectify the frontier as they plead it may be rectified, so as to include them in Poland? Of all the things that Wilson might have been anxious about on June 28, 1919, that was the thing that he was anxious about. The goat herds who came to see him at the Hotel de Crillon at the beginning of April. And if we were to ask why, we might say that it was a displacement of the many larger things he might have been anxious about. But I think that they embody for him the problem of thinking through borders in relation to majorities and minorities, embody it for him in a very personal way, embody Eastern Europe for him. They are the Eastern European people he will never encounter in Eastern Europe. They come to Paris to seek him out. And the ways in which they embody those issues are suggestive of the ways in which the issues of national self-determination in 1919 engender the Wilsonian concern and anxiety about minority rights. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Larry, for this amazing lecture, and also these beautiful reenactments of dialogues and discussions among the policymakers of the minority rights, and also it was a kind of time travel for us back to 1919. And I'm so happy because we have a large amount of questions. And Larry told us that he would be happy to see you. So the question is whether we can invite you to ask your questions directly. And I will go to the first one, Savra Stavru. I will invite everybody who had a question, and then they can decide whether they want to say it or not. It's not so easy, but maybe my colleagues can help me. Okay, so I will invite Rock, because I found Rock as first. Rock, are you still here? Great. Hi. Yes. So could you? Yeah. Beautiful. The floor is yours. We cannot hear you.
Yes, can you hear me now?
Yes, perfect.
Yes.
I'm trying to find my question actually in the chat because I have forgot it.
I put it in both.
In the chat, I can see it. Yeah. So yeah, the question is about assumptions that underpin the definitions of majorities and minorities used by Wilson and others. So how did they define ethnicity, ethnic communities? What constituted a minority for them? So I'm actually wondering, did Wilson and his team basically only considered members of these acknowledged quote-unquote nations, as were the Germans, the Czechs, the Hungarians, even the Jews, as they were thinking about minority protection, or did they also give some thought to people who refused to think of themselves as parts of these nations? For example, the people identifying as Bunyovci, as Shokci, as Silesians, as Khanaks, or even Roma and the Vlachs. So I'm assuming, of course, that they mostly were thinking about the former, but I'm wondering if they ever considered the latter too in their plans or planning. Thank you.
So great question. So the first thing I would say is that they don't have a good definition that they work with. And I wanted to emphasize this in the talk as well, that they move very easily among different terms: race, nation, nationality, people. Those are almost interchangeable terms for them as they use them, and they don't have solid definitions that they are able to work with. As far as the accepted nationalities go, we know that what the framework was for accepted nationalities, and again, they emerged from the Austro-Hungarian censuses, and they're based on language, on Umgangssprache, and that the accepted national identifications in the region grow out of the censuses that were taken by the Austro-Hungarian government every 10 years. They're based on language, and one of the things that this means is that there are a limited number of such identifications that are on the table, and that Jews, for instance, don't constitute a national grouping because they don't have an acknowledged language. Yiddish was not one of the choices on the Austro-Hungarian census. And in a way, it's one of the reasons that Jews are able to form a little bit of a wedge for beginning to think about this issue of minorities, because religious minorities are something that have been discussed previously in treaty law. And the ways in which Jews seem to bridge the boundaries between a religious minority and an ethnic minority means that in a discussion of Jews as a religious minority, you can also open up questions of what it means to be an ethnic or national minority. Let me say a word about the idea of more complicated definitions of peopledom. So no, Wilson, it doesn't occur to Wilson that Silesians might identify as Silesian, right? It makes sense to Wilson that they would come out German or Polish, but he is aware that depending on what their priests tell them or what their local authorities tell them, they might choose either one. That the person who might choose Polish in a perfectly free situation might choose German, depending upon what his priest told him to choose at Sunday Mass, or what the local landowner told him to choose. So it's suggestive of the fact, Wilson's hesitations around plebiscites, that he does have a somewhat plastic view of national identification. On the one hand, he believes that there is a true identification, and that if you could abolish all outside influences, that people would then be able to declare their true national identification. But he does recognize that in the real world, it's very hard to abolish all outside influences, and that leads him to an understanding of plasticity. I want to go back to a moment to the Colonel Sherman Miles expedition in Carinthia, in which they go door to door, and they discover peoples who Miles says are Slavs by blood, though it's not clear how he would know that, or what that would mean to understand them as being Slavs by blood, but call themselves Wendish and want to be part of Austria. So the kinds of questions that the peace conference is asking are questions that actually open up the very kinds of complicated identifications that you're alluding to, but the peace conference doesn't actually have the time or the energy to go into them in the kind of detail that you and I as scholars might want to employ in getting at those questions.
Thank you very much. The next was Zer Bilensky. I don't know whether I pronounced your name exactly. Oh, nice. Hi.
My question is about, and Professor, we've already alluded to this question, how President Wilson's racial attitudes in America, or whether reflected in his vision of Eastern European settlement after World War I, and whether his reputation in Eastern Europe can kind of somehow outweigh his tarnished reputation in America these days.
So first, let me say, Serhi, it's such a great pleasure to see you. We haven't seen each other now in such a long time, and I don't know when we will get to see each other again. But it gives me great pleasure to see you here, even through the medium of Zoom. So let me say this about Wilson and the ways in which categories of race and nation are used interchangeably by Wilson. It would perhaps be fair to say that Wilson goes into the peace conference believing that national difference is something that's clear. I might say as clear as black and white, and I wouldn't say that just metaphorically or figuratively, but as clear as black and white seem to him to be in the American context. The reason I think that they're analogous and interesting to think about alongside each other, the issues of race and the issues of nation, is that the thing that Wilson does that is really pretty terrible in the American context is that he allows for resegregation to take place, for the final demolition of post-Civil War Reconstruction, the resegregation of the federal civil services, something that takes place during the Wilson administration. And it's on the one hand, we can say this is because of Wilson's racism, and that's not really surprising that Wilson, born in Virginia in the 1850s, growing up in the Civil War South, would have racist attitudes. It would be hard to find a lot of white men born in Virginia in the middle of the 19th century who would not have attitudes that we would recognize as racist. But his segregationism is something pretty particular, and that is to say it has to do a little bit with his sense of technologies of coexistence, the belief that people will get along better if you separate them. Because this is something we see he very clearly believes in Eastern Europe, that peoples need to be separated out into national units that he also calls racial units. He's very disturbed, for instance, by what he understands to be the ethnic mixing of Anatolia, the complicated mixing of peoples in Turkey, and writes about it with anxiety. He calls it a hornet's nest, the racial mixing that he sees, and he sees it as potentially explosive. And Wilson's ideas about the separation of peoples, right, into national states in Eastern Europe are ideas that we could see as being in some ways implicitly segregationist or analogous to his segregationism in the American domestic context. This is a somewhat disturbing thing. It was disturbing to me when I came upon it because it connects a piece of what we think of as most regressive in Wilson's politics to a piece of what was conventionally supposed to be the most progressive in Wilson's politics, and thinks about the ways in which they align in his views of peoples and human coexistence. In terms of Wilson's reputation, of course, it's a strange thing that Wilson's reputation has collapsed in the United States at the same moment that Wilson's reputation was really restored at the end of the Cold War in Eastern Europe. I've written a little bit about Wilson as a hero in Eastern Europe. I didn't speak about it today, but in Poland, in Czechoslovakia, in Yugoslavia after the war, Wilson was a hero. His statues were everywhere. I'm sure the Prague train station was named for Wilson. The Prague train station, right, the big statue of Wilson is taken down when? In 1939, it's taken down, and it stays down through the whole communist period, goes up again at the end of the Cold War. It actually goes up, the statue is completed in 2011. So we're looking at a curious moment in which Wilson's name means something again in Eastern Europe at the same time that his credit has declined so drastically in the context of the United States. And that's an interesting study all by itself, because of course, in both cases, they are politically motivated, rise and fall of political credit and political status. Thanks for the question. Good to see you, Serhi.
Right, thank you so much. And I think we could just, because we have so many interesting questions from our audience, I would suggest that we just move on. And the next question would be from Messan Tosa. And could I invite you, Messan, to turn on your camera and ask your question, if that's okay?
Thank you very much. I think my question has been already addressed by the previous speaker. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, then we're moving on. And as I can see it, the next one would be Antonio Ferrara. Are you there?
Yes.
Okay, perfect.
Hi, good evening. So I have actually a couple of questions for our speaker, which first one is what you mentioned the Polish pogrom of 1918 as a driving forces between minority rights for Jews and so also for other minorities. What about Ukrainian pogroms of the same time, which were far larger? And then another question, which is were Wilson and cognizant about the prehistory of minority rights, about 1878 and all the 19th century discussion of minority rights, which was mostly also about Eastern Europe? Thanks.
So the people who are at the Paris Peace Conference are aware of some of the precedents that are connected to religious minority rights from the 19th century, and particularly at the Congress of Berlin would be the crucial precedent. It's not clear to me that Wilson himself is aware of that precedent, though he's made aware of it by his advisors as he comes to the peace conference. What's new in 1919 is the extension of that incipient principle of religious minority rights more broadly to the idea of national minority rights as something that could be potentially built into treaties. In terms of Ukraine, again, Wilson knows very little about Ukraine. And he, again, as with Masaryk explaining or not explaining the German minority in Czechoslovakia, Wilson is pretty dependent on, in his earliest stages, on what he learns from Paderewski, who is his parallel friend, right? He considers Masaryk a friend, he considers Paderewski a friend. And Paderewski explains to Wilson pretty early on that there is no such thing as a Ukrainian identity in Poland, that there are Ruthenian peoples who speak Polish in Poland, and that the differences are minimal and that they don't constitute a real minority, is what Paderewski explains to him. Wilson comes to learn more about this over the course of the peace conference and actually becomes somewhat disillusioned with what he's learned from Paderewski. But I would say he never comes to grips with the idea of a Ukrainian nationality that transcends Eastern Galicia and Ukrainian territory within the former empire and what is evolving as the Soviet Union. The idea of broader Ukrainian national identity is complicated for Wilson, and more than he has the bandwidth for as he's dealing with the peace conference. Lloyd George at one point says, rather, a little frivolously, but a little frankly, he says, I never met a Ukrainian until last week when I met a Ukrainian here in Paris. And then he says, and I'm not sure I want to ever meet another one, he says. The peace conference, the big four are busy not meeting with the Ukrainians over the course of the Paris peace negotiations and regarded as one factor too many for them to try to deal with. So the question of Ukrainian relations with Jews, as opposed to Polish relations with Jews, is something that they don't sort out, particularly over the course of the peace conference, and certainly not something that Wilson himself has any awareness of. They do regard the Lviv pogrom, probably correctly, as something which is carried out by Poles in Lviv in November of 1918. And that becomes in some ways the best known instance from which they generalize. They do understand that there is potentially a Ruthenian minority in the new Poland and that minority rights would need to protect the Ruthenians, who they sometimes understand to be Ukrainians and sometimes do not understand to be Ukrainians, just over the course of late 1918, early 1919.
Thank you very much. I don't know whether it can work, but we have some more very important questions. So if Larry, you are still ready to answer this question?
I'd be very happy.
Okay, then the next one is, I think, Raul. Raul Castells.
Thank you very much for your lecture. I'm going to make mine shorter than they are in the chat box. You've mentioned briefly the the association of Jews and other minorities with Bolshevism. And I was wondering if you could say more about what role do you think this fear of the spread of Bolshevism in association with minorities played for Wilson's sort of impact on the minority treaties? And if you think along those lines that Lenin's earlier notion of self-determination has any bearing on Wilson's one, if we can read it as a response to Lenin's notion of self-determination, which was more radical, contemplating self-determination for the colonies as well. And following up on this, I have a second question related to the former colonies and to the sort of the mandate system devised at the Paris Peace Conference, because these two tend to be studied separately. You have the minority treaties on the one hand, and you have the mandates on the other. And there's a brilliant book of Erez Manela on the mandates and the quest for self-determination, the beginnings of anti-colonial nationalism and so on. But if do we learn anything if we read the two together? If we look at the minority treaties and the mandate system as products of the same conference, of the same statesman deciding, what was Wilson's role in the mandate system and how does it relate to the one he played in the minority treaties? Thank you.
Great question, really, and a really important question. And I agree that Erez Manela's book is really illuminating for thinking about it. But let me go back to the first part of the question. So there's one piece of the question which is about Bolshevism and one piece of the question which is about mandates. Let me say first that that Bolshevism does loom large in Wilson's consciousness. He never actually references Lenin as the creator of the phrase of national self-determination, but I think he is aware that it has been raised by the Bolsheviks, the question of national self-determination. Even in the speech that I showed you, it's put in quotes, right, usually when it's presented for the first time, as if it's a phrase that Wilson is taking from elsewhere, national self-determination, that we've come to associate it so closely with him. I think we have to understand it a little bit as a bidding war for influence in Eastern Europe. That is to say that the Entente must offer national self-determination as a formula at the Paris Peace Conference, just because Lenin has already proposed it as a formula within the Bolshevik context. Obviously, anything Lenin is going to propose is likely to be more radical than anything Lloyd George and Clemenceau are going to propose in the context of the peace conference. But I do think that they do understand that in some sense they are bidding for the goodwill of the populations of Eastern Europe. Hungary 1919 emphasizes that pretty clearly for them. And there's some understanding that Wilson sees that it's partly about bidding for the goodwill of minorities as well as majorities in thinking about what the outcomes are of national self-determination. So yes, for sure, it's an important piece of it, and they're very interested to think alongside one another, Wilson and Lenin. In terms of the question about mandates versus independence, the mandates are clearly, I don't know whether you would agree, I would say clearly meant to be neocolonial in the way that they're structured, and they have quite a lot to do with the way that the peacemakers understand the difference between Europe and the Orient or the Ottoman Middle East, and the ways in which the political outcomes are structured in those different parts of the world. There's briefly a discussion about an Italian mandate in Albania following the war as well. But I mean, so it's something that's relevant for thinking about the post-Ottoman world. And possibly the most interesting piece of the mandate discussion from Wilson's point of view is that Wilson very seriously contemplates the possibility of an American mandate at Constantinople and the Straits. So actually in Europe as well as in Asia, it's proposed to him because, of course, that would have gone to Russia as war spoils had there not been a Russian Revolution, right? The Russians had been promised Constantinople and the Straits within the framework of war aims, and the Americans are tentatively offered the possibility of undertaking a mandate there, which Wilson worries over quite a bit. They're also offered the possibility of a mandate in Armenia, which Wilson thinks about as well. And he really is unsure about it, whether it would implicate him in the kind of imperial relation to territory that he himself finds troubling, or whether it would be the assumption of a responsibility that he could justify to himself. In any event, these are canceled by the fact that the American Senate never approves the treaty, never approves membership in the League of Nations. And I think at some point specifically rejects the idea of a mandate in Armenia. But Wilson is looking at the possibility of American mandates on the table, and even one at Constantinople, which would take you right to the edge of Europe.
Thank you. And now Kate Lebo is coming, and I'm so happy because she is the third former fellow of our institute, and it's always nice to see you, Kate. Hi.
Hi, Eva. It's great to see you, Larry. Hi, Larry. Thanks for the great talk, and it's lovely to see other members of the extended VWI community out there as well. I think so. The emphasis in your talk on the frames of reference and the sort of historical imaginaries that these different players brought to the table in Eastern Europe got me thinking in ways I really never have before about the idea of minority protections and what sort of historical imaginary the actors who are advocating minority protections, specifically some of the American Jewish leaders, were working with, because in the quotations you showed us, that the argument is not just that minority protections are going to protect minorities from discrimination, legal discrimination, for example, or political discrimination or civil discrimination. It's going to there's something much more existential about it, right? It's going to protect them from violence, or the absence of such protections will doom them to become victims of violence. So this may be a little bit off, sort of off the beaten track for you, but I'm wondering if you could speculate at all about sort of what assumptions the advocates of minority protections brought to the table, what understanding of anti-Semitism or of anti-Jewish violence, or of even sort of broader sort of narratives about Jewish emancipation in modern Europe framed those kinds of implicit arguments.
Mm-hmm. So I would say it's a great question and should be a whole book of its own, and perhaps it has been. But I haven't encountered it. What I would say is about that there's a certain tension here in the imaginaries, as you put it. One is a purely legal sense of equal rights, which is a liberal idea of what it would mean to provide minority protection and the kind of rights that are implicit in citizenship. And here I would say that one of the concerns that people have at the table in Paris is the example of Romania that constantly comes up, in which Jews were denied citizenship rights in the period for a long period in the late 19th century following Romanian independence, and an anxiety about whether Jews will be understood to be citizens in the new national states or will be classified as foreigners. But the other side of that question is one in which national minority rights, and this is a very Habsburg sense, are designed to preserve precisely the survival of national and distinctive culture. It's one of the things that Lloyd George and Wilson are worrying about when they worry about national minority rights being used to create an autonomous state within a state. The idea of language in the schools, the idea of separate national languages is something that even the American Jews who are intervening puzzle over, because many of them are coming from the perspective that assimilation through the hyphenated or melting pot American model is something that you would be looking for in new states as well in Eastern Europe. And the question of whether minority rights are actually designed to preserve the distinctiveness of the minority or to allow a perfect equalizing of people within a framework, a legal framework that does not distinguish among those peoples, is a tension that you can see within all of the discussions that surround minority rights at the conference and thereafter as well, and not only with respect to Jews. And it particularly revolves around the question of language that were so fundamental in the Habsburg monarchy and that, have to be rethought completely, from scratch within the context of the new national states. That's just a sort of nervous, first attempt to answer a really, really hard question. Wilson, I think, is an assimilator, right? He believes that the purpose of minority rights should be to allow the full assimilation of minorities into a majority patriotic national community. Although his only model for that would be American Immigrant Society, but that's an interesting model to bring to bear upon minorities in Eastern Europe. We can think of lots of reasons why it might not be applicable or workable, but it's probably the piece that Wilson brings to the table most readily. And I should say Wilson is someone who is politically dependent upon American immigrant communities who vote Democratic in sometimes in national elections, but not particularly friendly to them otherwise, in his somewhat patrician understanding of American culture and American patriotism.
We still have 3 more questions. So I ask you, Larry, whether you have still energy and time.
Of course I do.
Oh, great.
I would love to answer all the questions.
All right. So the next one is Mateusz Wachowski, and no worries, dear friends. Alex and Ivan Berteni, you will also come soon. So these are these 3 more questions which we haven't heard yet. So Mateusz Wachowski, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you very much. I'm really glad and happy that you mentioned the peasant delegation from the Orava. I just wanted to add some information about them because they presented themselves as peasants, but Ferdinand Machaj, for example, the leader of the delegation, was educated in Budapest. Piotr Borowy, one of the members of the delegation, he worked in the United States for many years. So this presentation as peasants wasn't really true for them, but more like this kind of, they wanted to present themselves as peasants from the region. So I worked about them in the archives in Zakopane. I just have a short question about the plebiscite in Teschen, Silesia, because it wasn't mentioned. So that you can add maybe a little bit of ideas what Wilson thought about this particular plebiscite that didn't take place because it was cancelled eventually. Thank you.
So you're quite right to mention it, right? I mean, the Teschen Silesia would be a case I don't know whether you agree, analogous to Orava and Spiš in that it's disputed between Czechoslovakia and Poland, and the issue of, of understanding the population is one that the Peace Conference finds very, very challenging. The idea of plebiscites that never take place, this is a whole study in itself, right? I listed for you what I understand to be the principal plebiscites that actually do take place, with the fantasy plebiscite of East Galicia 25 years in the future being almost the introduction to a separate study on plebiscites that never happened. The Dalmatian Islands plebiscite doesn't happen either, as far as I know, although Wilson is focused on it at the time. And we know that, Teschen Silesia is played out in, through the mechanisms of power politics that are just the ones that Wilson most strongly disapproves of. And in some ways, his hesitation to embrace plebiscites probably, limits the ways in which they're applied in the immediate post-war period. The fact that the people who oppose plebiscites are actually able to win Wilson over to a skeptical attitude towards those plebiscites. With respect to the delegation from Orava and Spiš, and the ways in which that's staged, I'd love to read what if you publish some of your own research on it, I'd be very interested in
yes, I have just recently written something. You can find it in the chat. It's in German, but I hope that most of you can read it.
Yes. Oh, good. Excellent. I will take the reference from the chat. You probably know that the committee that represents Orava and Spiš was headed by a famous Polish poet, Kazimierz Tetmajer, who was the leader of the special committee for making Orava and Spiš Polish. He was a poet who probably felt that he was close to the peasants, right? But I mean, the Tetmajer brothers both have this interesting relation to the people and to the peasantry that's celebrated in the famous Wyspiański play, Wesele. But nevertheless, I think that you're quite right in seeing the peasant delegation as being a little bit of an elite construction, but it's a performance that's being staged for an audience of one. It's being staged for Woodrow Wilson himself by people who have actually thought about what kind of a theatrical performance you would want to present to Woodrow Wilson, and the ways in which this particular performance might grab his imagination. And look how successfully they grab his imagination on June 28, 1919. That's the one thing that's on his mind. Thank you for the questions.
Thank you. The next one is Ivan. Ivan, are you still here? It was just a question for Ivan, or just a comment about the Hungarian border history. Ivan, are you here? We cannot hear you. I don't find your question.
Hello, it was just a comment. Thank you very much for being here, and congratulations to this brilliant, very, very good lecture. Thank you very much for being here.
Okay, then the very last one is Alex Korb, also an YWI fellow once.
Yeah, and soon again, I hope. Yeah, thanks for a great talk, Larry. That was also nicely entertaining. And my question is, you well explained quite well how Wilson was seen as a hero across Eastern Europe. But I would argue that he was also, and increasingly so over the course of the 20s, seen as a villain who sort of messed things up, partly because many promises have been broken. And so I think Hitler successfully then, in a way, embodies the counter narrative, like a new order versus the Paris order. And I think Hitler successfully starts to replace Wilson, not only amongst the vanquished, but also amongst some of the victor states like Romania. And so my question would be, where are the breaking points? So where does Wilson's popularity start to crumble, and why?
So we know that it crumbles in Hungary very fast. It does exist at first in Hungary. That is to say, Archibald Carey Coolidge, the Harvard professor whom I mentioned in the lecture, travels to Budapest in late 1918 and reports to Wilson that everyone loves him in Budapest. They're looking to him for their national salvation in the post-war world. And Wilson is someone who actually is interested in Hungary because he's been lobbied by Hungarian Americans on the rather unusual premise that Hungary is a nation that has been oppressed by Vienna for centuries, and therefore it needs to be emancipated from Vienna by Wilson in the same way that other subject nationalities need to be emancipated from Vienna. So in the case of Hungary, we could see the model example of a place where Wilson is popular for about 10 minutes after World War I, and then his popularity dissipates immediately, and I would say has never returned. I don't know whether Wilson would even be discussed in Budapest today, but obviously Trianon is something that's alive and well as a memory, and the centennial has just been marked in 2020. I do want to. I don't know a lot about Wilson's standing in Romania. He doesn't give Romania benefits enormously from the peace treaties, just in terms of its populations. But Wilson is not particularly charmed by Queen Marie of Romania, whom he speaks with in Paris. He has lunch with Marie in Paris, and is irritated by her more than he is charmed by her. And there is a period in the late 1919 where Wilson is ranking very irritably the nations in Eastern Europe that he finds most difficult to get along with. And the Romanians, the Bulgarians all play a role in Wilson's negative imaginary of places that he feels have let him down in their post-war conduct. In terms of the principal nations where Wilson is revered, and we know what they are. They're Poland, Czechoslovakia, and Yugoslavia. Those are the places where his standing is highest. And I think that what we'd have to say is that for the most part, we don't see a clear breaking point until the late 1930s, because even though Narevsky, understands that Wilson has not been the kind of true friend that he wanted Wilson to be, he kind of needs Wilsonianism. That is to say, in order, the independence of Poland and the success of independent Poland is to some extent inseparable from the ideological Wilsonianism that plays a role in its creation. I think that's even more true in Czechoslovakia. And if we were looking at Yugoslavia, where, say, I think that the Zagreb main square is called Wilsonov Trg right up into the 1930s, we would say that for people who believe in Yugoslavia, which is not everyone by any means inside of Yugoslavia, but for people who believe in Yugoslavia, they need Wilsonianism as well. And that you can't actually break with the image of Wilson, even if you feel somewhat sour about some of the history of Wilson's dealings with your own country. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you so much. It was really amazing that after 100 years, there are so many questions which we could discuss for the whole night here, or the 4 day, Larry. So I'm sure that we have to continue in the form of a seminar or in another, so in a real form, to do something together, because we learned a lot. We were really inspired a lot. So thank you so much. Thank you also for you, dear friends and colleagues, for the excellent questions and the beautiful discussion. And yes, I wish you all the best and see you soon in another occasion.
Thank you so much, Eva, and thank you all for participating in the event. Next time, let's do it live.
Yes, of course, of course. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.